there were two kinds of issues at the end of 2021 that Putin put on the table. One was about Ukraine itself, and the other was more generally about the U.S. and NATO vis-a-vis Russia, and especially missile security and nuclear security. When it came to Ukraine, there were three basic points. One was no NATO enlargement, which I think is the fundamental point. Second was Crimea. Crimea is a very interesting story, by the way, because Russia was content, I would say, maybe it's not exactly the right word, but Russia accepted that Crimea would be part of Ukraine when Ukraine was responsibly recognizing Russia's stakes in Crimea. Yanukovych was negotiating with Putin a long-term lease because, after all, Russia's naval fleet has been in Sevastopol since 1783. And, you don't have to know too much history to know that the first Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was explicitly by the UK and France to push the Russian fleet out of the Black Sea, basically to eliminate Russia's naval force in Sevastopol. And it was, in fact, canceled for 20 years. That's Russia's historical memory, and rightly so. So the first thing was there had been a modus vivendi on Crimea. But after the Yanukovych overthrow, and Crimea being overwhelmingly Russian, and there was the plebiscite and whatever, Russia claimed Crimea. Putin said at the end of 2021, Crimea is Russian. Okay, one could negotiate that in de facto terms, but that was a starting point. And by the way, many people in the U.S. government today and senior politicians privately will tell you, yeah, we understand that about Crimea, because that is core Russian national security. I mean, core. So that was number one. Number two, no, I'm sorry, that was number two. NATO number one, Crimea number two, and the third was the Donbass. And at that point, Russia had not annexed the Donbass region, Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia had said, implement the treaties that Ukraine has agreed to but failed to implement, the Minsk II agreement. This is pretty basic. Implement what you've agreed. And France and Germany were guarantors in what's called the Normandy process of the Minsk agreements. We heard, an incredibly weird interview by former Chancellor Angela Merkel that, I didn't really mean it with the Minsk II agreements. We didn't think they were going to be implemented. We were just giving Ukraine time to build up its military force and so forth. Unbelievable. I don't even believe that was Merkel's view when the agreements were signed, but the statement now was so cynical. And Russia was saying, honor what you agreed. Is that outrageous? Is that crazy? Is that some, Peter the Great villainy? No, it was pretty basic. So I said to the White House, look, are you kidding? We're going to have a war over NATO enlargement that you claim isn't going to take place, and Crimea, which the real story about, and the Minsk II agreements. We're going to have a big war and see Ukraine destroyed over these three factors. Well, the U.S. refused to negotiate. But fundamentally, it refused to negotiate over all of them, in fact. But it absolutely refused to negotiate over NATO. Then there are the real security issues of where are you putting your missiles and what are you putting up against our borders? And those are serious issues. We almost had nuclear war in 1962 when the Soviet Union, in a dingbat move of Nikita Khrushchev, put offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. And the world almost ended at that moment because the U.S. said, no, we will not have those on our border. So if the U.S. thought just a little bit, if Biden thought just a little bit, what Putin was saying was not crazy. It was the grounds for serious negotiation. But of course, it was completely brushed aside. And we have what we have. Now, what is very important to know, and also our wonderful mainstream media have not spent 5 minutes on this crucial point. After the Russians invaded on February 24th, about 2 weeks later, Zelensky said, neutrality wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Donbass and Crimea, we should talk about that. And what happened actually, what really happened, which I don't think I ever read a word about in the New York Times. I apologize. They may have written something on page A17. But what really happened was that when Zelensky said this, the Russians said, that is grounds for us negotiating a quick end to this. And actually, there were exchanges of papers. In fact, the Russians, based on Zelensky's statements, exchanged papers. The Ukrainians came back. The Turkish foreign ministry was the mediator. Actually, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, played a role. And by the end of March, they were close to an agreement based on Ukrainian neutrality. Now, I've heard this story from a lot of insiders in some length. One day, the Ukrainians showed up and said, we're not negotiating anymore. That's the truth. You'd think a New York Times reporter might have just a glimmer of curiosity about that, but of course, no, because this whole episode was just brushed aside. But what we have good reason to believe is the United States told the Ukrainians, no, do not negotiate on that basis. Do not negotiate on the basis of neutrality. And Naftali Bennett gave a strange but very interesting long interview online. I wonder if it's still online. I listened to it at length. And he said, he became friendly with Putin. He became friendly with Zelensky. He said, I can help mediate between this. So he was alongside the Turkish mediators. And he said we were close to an agreement. And then he said the U.S. stopped it. And he said, I disagree with what they did, but maybe they were right. That's what he said. Then a couple of days later, of course, he walked back the statement. No, I've been misinterpreted and so forth. He committed what is technically, of course, known as a gaffe, which means he accidentally told the truth and had to walk it back. But basically, my point is the basis for negotiation was there at the end of 2021, and it was nearly achieved in March 2022. And the U.S. did not want peace on either occasion. I don't say the U.S., I should say the Biden team did not want peace on either occasion. We now have another year of mass bloodshed, further escalation, a complete mess.
Okay, so let me drill down on this point here about the start of the war. Clearly, they were not willing to negotiate on a reasonable basis to prevent it. They were willing to say to Putin, you better not do it, and we'll punish you with sanctions and things if you do. But they weren't willing to negotiate on a reasonable basis. My question is, and I think you're alluding to this is your belief, but I wonder if you could tell me, this from speaking with Democrats in power and so forth, that they deliberately provoked this war. They wanted this war to happen in order to launch what they all told the consensus is Stavridis and Hillary Clinton and so many others in the New York Times and Foreign Affairs and all over. They said, we want to replicate the Afghan war of the 1980s. They thought Kiev would fall almost immediately and that we would be backing an insurgency based out of the West or based out of Poland, and that we would do the Rambo 3 and bleed them to bankruptcy, just like Osama bin Laden just finished doing to us. And So I wonder if you think that when they were saying, you better not, that they were actually deliberately provoking the attack. In fact, I have a statement where Putin himself said, geez, I think they're trying to provoke me into doing something stupid here, but then I might not have a choice.
It may be truly, I don't know. I tend to doubt it, but I may be an innocent in this. My view is they thought they could kind of bluff their way or push their way or lean their way to what they wanted without Putin daring to do it. But maybe your version is absolutely correct, which it really could be. But my feeling all along is that the U.S. neocons basically think they can get away with things. I don't think they love long wars. I don't know. They don't tell me their innermost thoughts, but I think they believe that they can get away with things. I think they believed that they could overthrow or, help to overthrow Yanukovych and basically make a new fait accompli. But then Putin reacted, and it didn't turn out that way. I think that they thought that the threat of what they thought would be, the crushing sanctions that would just bring the Russian economy to its knees, an extremely naive idea, by the way, and I told them that also. And there I have some professional expertise. You're not going to bring Russia to its knees through these sanctions. But in any event, I think they thought, maybe he won't dare. Then we continue to arm, we continue to make the Ukraine army interoperable, we continue to strengthen the regime, we continue to build these fortification lines, and one day we announce they're a member of NATO. I think that they thought you can get this on the cheap. I think, by the way, Putin thought, all right, this is pretty bad. I think I can push them to the negotiating table very quickly. I don't think Putin counted on a long war either. And indeed, after a couple of weeks, Zelensky said, yeah, there is actually grounds for negotiating. So I think Putin probably thought, I can push them back the other way. And then the U.S. at that point said, okay, now we have the makings of something probably pretty good. As Lloyd Austin said, famously at the time, now our goal is to weaken Russia. So that view, I don't know if it was there in December, but it was pretty explicitly stated by the end of March that now we'll have a long war. I think there was an element of bluff here also, because I think they didn't believe that Putin would be able to politically mobilize Russia for a longer war. I don't think they counted logistics at all. Their ideas about the world economy and what they called the financial nuclear option of cutting Russia out of SWIFT is so wrong. It was just absolutely. At the time I wrote an op-ed. Come on, guys, this is not how things are going to unfold. But my view in this escalating battle is that each side has thought this will push the other to back down, and what you have is two very strong wills. One says, no one tells NATO where to go, when to go, how to go. We are the United States of America. And the other side says, NATO will not be on our border. And, I think the neocons have led us into one debacle after another, and that this is yet another one. Of course, it's led Ukraine into a far worse debacle. But it's this clash of wills, not wanting long war, but each one thinking, in this game of chicken, I can push the other to back down. And so far, we're on a path of escalation. And frankly, it's an extraordinarily dangerous path of escalation. And that's the other game of the media. You're not allowed to say anything is dangerous. Oh, we can't have nuclear blackmail. We can't have this and we can't have that. Well, you know what? We should worry, because there are a lot of irresponsible people in our government and in Russia and in other places, and you gotta worry all the time that escalation can get out of hand.